Hi there, I'm Sam Flegal, and I'm a Norse Mythology fantasy artist. And you can see my stuff if you want to check it out over at fatefulsigns.com. And I'm here with this guy.
I'm Kenny. I'm a tattooer, and I'm just kind of curious about the Germanic spiritual path of the Heathenry and all things Norse.
Cool. So we've titled this series, and we now have a series because there's 2 episodes.
That's right.
Well, you didn't get to all your questions last time, so we thought we'd log in again and tackle a few more questions this time. So what burning questions did you have as we left things off last week?
So first, last week was great.
Good. I'm glad. I really enjoyed it too.
Yeah, I had a ton of fun last week, and I think I learned a lot. I've started reading more. You mentioned last week, Heathenry is it's a spiritual path with homework, and I really enjoy that. So I've been reading some of the Volsung saga, which I mentioned to you earlier, and that's kind of where I've started off, just because my wife Caitlin is taking a Viking myth class. And so she happens to have a few of the sagas for her school reading. And I'm like, well, I'm going to take these.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Which leads me to my question for today, which is the Prose Edda, the Poetic Edda, and the Hávamál. What are these books? And how, if at all, do they connect with one another?
Yeah. So the first thing is that the Hávamál is a part of the Poetic Edda. It is one book within a section of poetry. And so the big distinctions are the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. The Prose Edda, which prose just means stories and poetic means poems. And that's really how it's broken down, is one is a collection of stories that references some of the poems, but the other is the older collection of skaldic poetry that refers to the various myths and traditions of the Viking people. And so when we talk about the two, the first with the Prose Edda is a record that was recorded by Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson. And Snorri was a poet who wanted to make sure to preserve the poetic forms of his culture, because after he was writing around the 1200s, so 11th century or wait, was that 12th or 13th century? I'm not good at the distinction, but around 1200s in Iceland, and he saw that culture was changing and the traditional verse form of his culture were being lost. And so in order to help preserve it, he wrote down what it was. And so the Prose Edda actually starts off with a pretty good section on what are the different forms of poetry. The big one being skaldic poetry. I mean, if you play D&D, you've heard of skalds before. They're, Viking warrior bards is how they're so often portrayed. I don't know that that's particularly accurate, but they were Viking poets. And that is a specific type of Old Norse verse. The other, he lists several, numerous different types of poet styles, but one of the other big ones is Galdr or Galdic poetry. And the reason that this is so important is that was the poems that were written in and about magic, about Viking magic. And so what way this has always been described to me, which I love so much and will share as well, is that if you can imagine going to see a Shakespeare play in iambic pentameter, and iambic pentameter has that certain flow, and you've been watching for 20 or 30 minutes, and you're into the poems, when all of a sudden a witch or a wizard appears and begins to cast a spell on the stage, and in the process of casting the spell speaks in Irish limericks, and all of a sudden you're like, oh crap, this is so different, this feels so different. That's the difference between the Galdic poems and the Skaldic poems. And Galdr was always repeated 3 times at least. And so this actually has a little interesting cultural trait to it, which is that when the Old Norse people would write down things, if a letter repeated itself, if a rune repeated itself, they would not write the rune a second time, because they believed that you were beginning to invoke a magical spell by repeating a word. So Kenny, your name has 2 N's in it. If I was to write your name in runes, I would use the rune for K, the rune for E, only 1 rune for N, and then a Y. I would not put both N's in there. Otherwise, we would begin casting spells together. And that's not what we're here to do today.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so I find all that stuff really fascinating. But the reason we have so much information is because Snorri, first and foremost, recorded down the poet forms. Okay, so then what else is in the prose Edda? He then goes on to open up the story section with this story about the fall of Troy from Greek mythology, and how these warriors left Troy and came north, and those warriors' names were Odin and Thor, and they became chieftains and settled the north. And later on, Northerners thought they were gods, but they weren't really gods. They were actually just Trojans who came north. And the reason that's in there, there's a few reasons, but the main one being when a scholar was writing about mythology in 1200, the steep in Middle Ages, one had to be very careful about the Catholic Church and who you were pissing off. And so Snorri was backed financially by various noble institutions who wanted the preservation of not just the poetry, but the history of their people. It was really important to the nobility of the time to preserve the history and to preserve this entertainment form, which was skalds performing at court or in front of large groups of people. But you got to be careful. And so there's this little bit in the front that's like, don't worry, they're just Trojans, and then everything that comes after, you can basically skip that first part and just read, and you get this full myth cycle of, who is the High One? Well, the High One is Odin. And well, what does Odin know? And it lists the things that Odin knows. And there's these conversations, and it talks about the goddesses, and then it tells several of the main stories that we know. And they're, all that's recorded by Snorri. Now, there are discrepancies. So Snorri references the Poetic Edda, or more accurately, he references some of these older poems. But we don't know which version of the Poetic Edda he had, because it would have been translated and copied in order to move it around, right? Like there wasn't massive publishing then. And so maybe he only had memorized these poems as an early scholar. Maybe someone else taught them, to him. Maybe he had access to the actual manuscripts in some way. But the poems that he referenced went back to poems that are in the Poetic Edda, but all of the poems he referenced are not identical to the poems we have in the Poetic Edda. So clearly he either took a lot of liberties, which there are pretty good evidence that he did take some pretty dramatic liberties, but then also going back with the prose Edda or the Poetic Edda, the poems are actually different where you put them side by side. They basically mean and say similar things, but he did change words. And so there's a couple of big things that Snorri changed that I think are worth noting. The first is that Snorri is the only one who references hell and Niflhel. Earlier terms do reference hell, but there's some question in whether or not the realm of mist, Niflheim, is hell or they're separate. And Snorri very distinctly separates them, but earlier sources don't, and so there's some confusion there. Another thing that Snorri does is Snorri talks about the dark elves pretty regularly, but dark elves are not referenced in very many other sources before Snorri. Before that, it's only the Dvergar, or dwarves, which if you play D&D, you know that deep dwarves are called Durgar, which it's just an anglicized version of Dvergar. So there are liberties like that where things that a lot of people take for granted as, well, this is Norse mythology, this must be true. Well, it was true according to Snorri, but he was a historian trying to preserve written form, and we know that he added in the section at the beginning about the Trojans. So what was stopping him from adding in other things? And so we don't know if some of the stories were his creation. We do know that several of the stories were referenced. One other big thing I think is important to talk about is he talks a lot about Ragnarok and the twilight of the gods. And partly why this was important to Snorri is because he could also point to the fact that not only were these guys Greek heroes, so we're connecting back to Rome ultimately, but they also all died and are gone, and the old way is gone. And so for Snorri, Ragnarok represented in many ways the end of Viking or Norse paganism in the north. And parts of his Ragnarok are slightly different than the poems about Ragnarok. But I do think it's important. A lot of people say, oh, well, Ragnarok and the death of Balder, those things are Christianized because Snorri had access to the Bible and the apocalypse that's described in the Bible. But absolutely not true. The Vikings had their own version of the end of the world that goes back even further. And there's even a reference to events that happened in Ragnarok in some pottery that's been found. And I'm bad about this, but I want to say it's around 300. And so 300 in the north is really just when the Bible was being written at the Council of Nicaea in Rome in the south. And so there was an end of the world. Did that end of the world become influenced by the ideas of Christianity? Absolutely. We cannot take for granted that the merging of the southern Christian culture with the northern pagan culture, even in 1200 AD, would have been really dramatic and affecting the thought processes of people at that time. So anyway, so that's the prose Edda to ask the first. Now, see, I told you before we started, I was like, this one question about the books is actually a way bigger question than you could possibly realize, right?
Okay. So that's the prose Edda written by Snorri, right? Yep. Okay. And then in it, he's trying to essentially preserve the oral history of I guess we'll say the Vikings or the Norse. Okay. And so he was, but in order to subvert the Catholic Church, the wrath of the church, he was saying that Odin and Thor and probably Freyr or, whoever were all came down from Rome. And then fast forward when the parents stopped listening, he actually goes into everything about the Norse myths as we know them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And another key point of him telling the stories he told is he wanted to preserve the kennings. So similar to your name, Kenning or Kening, kenning, which is things like, instead of saying gold, a poetic way of saying gold would be to say Freya's tears. Now, I just did a painting about Freya crying her tears of red gold. And so that was why did Freya have golden tears? Well, let me tell you the story about Freya and how she lost her husband and why she wept those golden tears. And so every story that's preserved is largely preserved so that when the kenning is used, there's an explanation for that kenning. A simple thing, instead of calling Odin, he would be referred to as Allfather or the blind one because of his one eye, or as Grimnir, the masked one. Well, why is he called Grimnir? Well, here's the story about this time. And so that's what a lot of the prose Edda was preserving, is these stories that are referenced just one little line at a time in the poetry.
Okay.
So then we go back to the poetic Edda. And we have two preserved versions of the poetic Edda, the big one being the Codex Regius, which was the Danish Book of Kings, which somehow made its way, which also, I just love that name, the Codex Regius. Like, that sounds like some D&D magic stuff right there. But yeah, so the Viking Book of, the Danish Book of Kings, which somehow made its way to Iceland and was preserved and kept in Iceland, and was later discovered at a later period and kept secure, and then like copies were made and it was handled the right way. There is another version of the Poetic Edda that was also found in mainland Denmark. And I don't know as much about that one, but I do know in a couple cases, a couple of the poems are different. So even in these earlier sources, we have cases of the poems being slightly different. Again, very similar. We're talking about mostly like word changes for the most part.
Well, that's probably just like the result of these initially not being written down.
Absolutely.
And just kind of just being passed down in an oral tradition, kind of like how Beowulf was originally a song or a poem.
Yes. Yep. Exactly right. And so what gets interesting, at least as you can see, I love this kind of stuff. So the Poetic Edda is we think around 1,000 to 1,100. So its preserved state is only about 150, 200 years before Snorri. So we're talking about, generation gaps here, but we're not talking about like massive 1,000-year gaps in time. So the Poetic Edda is a collection of poems, the first poem of which is, and I brought my book here, the Voluspa. The Voluspa is book 1. And so what Voluspa means is the Volva or the Vala was the seer, the prophetess. And what's interesting is in the English language, the word witch actually cognates back to Wala. And so the V making a W sound, but being a V. And so it was the prophecy of the seer. And in the Voluspa, the Odin goes down into hell and summons forth this old seer who we think is a giant. And she first tells Odin, yes, I saw the formation of the world. And she tells about where, the first being and where giants come from and where the 9 worlds come from. And then she tells of the first war. And then Odin's so impressed with her lore that she then goes on to tell Odin secrets that supposedly only he is supposed to know, like how he lost his eye and what treasures he has and what magic he knows. And so then he's so impressed that he showers her with gold and says, please tell me of the future. What have you seen? And then she proceeds to foretell Ragnarok and the end of the world. And so there's, I believe, 66 stanzas of poetry in the Voluspa. And it goes, from the beginning of time to the end. Also famously in the Voluspa is the list of names of dwarves. And those dwarves' names are now famous largely because of The Hobbit. One of the most famous dwarf names in Norse mythology being Gandalf, which means wand elf, actually. Which I think is very interesting, again, talking about the difference between dark elves and light elves. Why does a dwarf have a name that means wand elf in the older sources? And it's because there's not really a clear distinction between elves and dwarves, that they're both these spiritual, otherworldly beings. And there are certain things that elves tend to do and certain things that dwarves tend to do, but the lines are much blurrier than we like to think in our modern D&D and Tolkien set.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Tolkien just permeates it. Like as soon as you talk about this kind of stuff to anybody who, especially gamers like you and me, like we're immediately just like washed over with what Tolkien gave us.
Yes, absolutely. And people get upset about it. So, I mean, if you listen to this, I mean, like he's just listing names and he's talking about there's Dvalin, Nar, Nain, Dane, Biffer, Boffer, Bomber, Nori. And then, on the next page, Feely, Keely, Fundin, Nolly. And you're like, wait a minute. There's Gandalf and Thorin and Vindolf. And, it keeps going on. But largely everything we think about dwarves is referring to that stuff. So then book 2 of the Poetic Edda is the Hávamál. And so that's what you asked about. And the Hávamál means the sayings of Har, or the wisdom of the High One. Har is the High One. And as is established in the Prose Edda, we know that the High One is Odin. And so it's the wisdom of Odin. It's Viking life advice. I tell people it's kind of like Proverbs for Vikings or Poor Richard's Almanac for Vikings, where the advice is everything from eat a small amount before going to a feast so that you're not so hungry that you gorge yourself. Better to spend time talking and learning the minds of the men in your community. I mean, that's amazing advice. Like,
yeah,
that kind of stuff is in there, and it's so good. The most quoted verse is verse 77, which really captures the Viking thoughts about life and death. Which I'll read verse 78, which is, cattle die and kinsmen die, and so one dies oneself. One thing now that never dies is the fame of a dead man's deeds.
Yeah.
And so it's that same idea of, we know that we live now. I'm going to leave my mark here in the minds of my ancestors and so on, and the community, essentially. And so a lot of the Viking concepts of fame and the importance of fame while you're here, and the deeds that you do is captured. And so the first section of the Hávamál, one prevailing theory is that it was actually poems that fathers taught their sons in a warrior cult or a warrior culture, in a similar way, like, this is how a man leads a good life, and, you know, passing that knowledge on to your son in the time. And there's even some thought that perhaps men or boys in a man-making ritual might have to recite certain verses or show that they had this knowledge. It's also thought to be why the wolves were associated with Odin, is the idea of young men being wolves in the woods is a common society. And we know that there was a point in earlier pagan culture where young men were sent to live in the woods and act as shock troops and hunters. It was thought that in the time in their life, basically when their testosterone's so high that they're actually a danger to society, just get them out in the woods. When they're like 21, they can come back and, you know, be a man. But there's also lots of symbolism around the death of the boy in becoming the man, and the idea that as Odin died on the tree to gain knowledge, we all die at various points in our lives and become someone or something new, in the idea of like a ritualistic way of looking at aging. And so a lot of that is in the Hávamál as well, as a way of like teaching one how to grow and lead a good life. But it's not just the Völuspá and the Hávamál that are captured in the Poetic Edda. Off the top of my head, I want to say it's like 13 or 14 different sections of verse. I know another really famous one is the Lokasenna, where Loki is not invited to a feast. He gets really drunk and he gets pissed that he's not been invited to the feast. And so he comes like barging into Odin's hall and just goes through and insults all of the different gods and goddesses in turn. I mean, he basically calls Freya a whore and, goes through all sorts of, looks like we lost Kenny there for a minute. Hopefully Kenny will log back in here. So he just goes through all of that. So, hey, there you are.
Oh, geez, Louise. Yeah, I heard almost all of that.
Yeah, no problem.
We didn't have the crazy internet problems. I'm sure Comcast.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So, and then the Poetic Edda even has a story about Thor, who a dwarf tries to steal his daughter, and then Thor and this dwarf get in a shouting match where they start throwing riddles back and forth at each other. And the ultimate end, not to, spoiler alert, 1,000-year-old story about to be spoiled, but the dwarf stays out so long that the sun comes up and the sun turns the dwarf to stone. And so that same idea was later used in The Hobbit of the trolls being turned to stone as the riddle contest goes on throughout the night, or the trickery of the trolls goes on throughout the night. And so that's another case where things get a bit muddy, is the difference between the giants and the gods, and the difference between things like trolls and giants, or ettins and giants, and trolls and dwarves and elves. Like, there weren't super codified things and all this. There is certain traits that you can see again carried through. But anyway, so that's ultimately what the Poetic Edda is, the earliest 1,000-year-old written form of Norse mythology. And there are a few earlier sources, but all the earlier sources are things like grave sites, burial sites, where carbon dating proves that these artifacts we've found are much older. But without the books, without the Codex Regius, which is the Poetic Edda, and later the Prose Edda by Snorri, we would not have as much information about Norse mythology as we do. And we touched on this some last episode, but that is also why we have things as it's recorded in the Iceland way, which goes back to the Danish way, which puts the gods and goddesses in the order that the Danes thought was accurate. And I also think it's important. I think that's why also Odin is such an important god, is Odin was the god of poetry. And so as poets were the ones recording this form, of course, the god of poetry stands out in the artist's mind. And the relationship being the idea that Odin's, which his name means woad, which means frenzy, but it can also be the frenzy of enlightenment, the frenzy of inspiration. It was also thought that alcohol helped with inspiration. So the relationship between artists and booze goes back quite a long time.
That's kind of like, so obviously Odin being the high one, yet like you and countless others wear Thor's hammer because Thor was a much more popular deity, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Among the common people, especially among common men, Thor was held up as way more prevalent. And as we said last time, it was Thor's hammer that blessed people. It was Thor's hammer that was responsible for hallowing sacred spaces. And so there's a lot of ritual around Thor's hammer. And I think it is also worth noting, like Odin had several powerful magical items in his spear Gungnir and his rings Draupnir, but none of those things were considered to be as great as Mjolnir, the hammer of the gods. I mean, it doesn't get much more metal and intense than that.
That's true. Okay, so all right, so then so to sum all that up, we've got the Prose Edda is like the history according to Snorri, is essentially, right? And then the Poetic Edda is just kind of like the written form of this oral tradition of Norse mythology.
Yeah, exactly right. And talking about writing forms, even within the Hávamál, scholars are able to note there's at least 4 different distinct writing styles. And that's just one book of the Völuspá. So the Völuspá is probably the work of, at least tens, if not hundreds, of different skalds. And there's pretty good evidence that the different poems go back to different points in history, some of them being more modern. And the Völuspá is actually thought to be, the reason it's first is it's thought to be one of the oldest of the poems, but there's no way to know how old it goes back in an oral tradition, just that there are things that match references in it that do go quite far back. And there have been some interesting historical discoveries as well. There, I believe it was only about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a dig going on, I want to say in Sweden, but somewhere in Scandinavia. And they realized that they had not just discovered a burial mound, but that they discovered a temple that had been caved in during the time of conversion to preserve the sacred space. And some of the layout of the temple form matched a poem about Freya, where Freya was talking about where certain things should go.
Wow.
it seemed like a really bizarre part of the Poetic Edda. Like no one ever thought it was that significant. And then suddenly, back to back with this archaeological find, there's a lot of research going into, oh man, there could be so much coded in this old pagan poetry in an attempt to preserve things that a pagan of 1,000 years ago would read and go, oh, I know exactly what that means. But to us, we're just like, I don't know, that shit sounds cool.
Right.
You know, like, but then to have archaeology prove, or in some cases disprove, certain long-held beliefs about different parts of it, meaning that, I mean, parts of this poetry clearly goes back even deeper, but that is not, unless we find another book that's not ruined and destroyed after being in some tomb for another several hundred years or hundreds of years, we're never going to have the answer to these questions. And I think that that's part of what's appealing about Norse mythology is there's all these amazing stories that have been preserved, but as you get into them and dig deeper, there's all these unanswered puzzles that you start asking questions. Well, what is up with the dark elves, and who were the dwarves really? And I think in some ways that's what inspired Tolkien, is this idea of what if I could answer those questions, at least for the English speaking people, you know, and I could, what if I could codify those things? And I'll admit the same is really appealing to me, as within my paintings, I put my own takes on what I think those stories mean.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think part of, I mean, as an artist myself, although not obviously like you on your caliber, but part of what's appealing about these kind of things is examining history, or like these poems, or really any subject matter through your own lens.
Yeah.
Right. Is being able to put your own spin on it. And
I think that's what Snorri was doing too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
People get a little like, how dare Snorri take liberties? And I'm like, well, but how could he not? You know, like, I mean, he was a poet.
Yeah.
You know, what poet has never taken liberties? Like that's crazy.
I'm very sure that like Snorri followed the rule of cool every now and again.
Whatever that was in Iceland about 1,000 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Or 800, 900 years ago. So.
Okay, so the Poetic Edda is made up of the Volupsa and the Hávamál. Is there like a Return of the Jedi kind of?
There's the Poetic Edda consists of 13 or 14 different. Hold on, I'm pulling up Wikipedia here. It may even be as many as 31. Yeah, it contains 31 different poems.
Wow.
Okay, so in the Codex Regius, there's the Voluspa, the Hávamál, the Ballad of Valherndir, the Grimnismal, which is the Ballad of Grimnir, the Ballad of Skirnir, the Poem of Harbord, the Lay of Heimir, Loki's Wrangling, which is Lokasenna, which I was talking about earlier, the Lay of Thrym, the Lay of Volund, which is the Volund saga as well, which is what Snorri wrote about. And then the Ballad of Alvis, or the Alvismal, is what I was talking about, which was the battle between Thor and the dwarf who turns to stone.
So all these different poems are in this greater overarching, the umbrella that is the Poetic Edda.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, there's the Niflung cycle, which includes the whole story of Fafnir and how he was a dwarf who gained so much greed that he became a dragon. And I mean, it goes on and on. Like you know, Wikipedia said in the front there, 31 different poems is what I thought it was like 13 or 14, but I was half. So it's 31. And I've honestly not read back to back the entire Poetic Edda. I've read it all, but it was years worth of reading, because it is a little bit like reading Shakespeare or reading Beowulf. Like, I love Beowulf, but you know, such a great story, but it's so layered and deep. And that is actually another source that a lot of people find information on Norse mythology, specifically the English version of Germanic culture, is that Beowulf references a lot of traditions as well, and there's some pagan code in those traditions as well that people are piecing out in modern times, which I think is also super interesting.
Right. Yeah, we go back to like Beowulf, for example. So we're on it. So Beowulf talking about all these different. You get those like pieces of the puzzle. It's like that's what's going on at that point of time. Or you can even go back to Christian rituals in that part of time when they're like, don't do this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, that's probably this, that, and the other thing were what was happening.
Absolutely.
And kind of reverse engineer paganism that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And even more specifically in Beowulf, it actually records a ritual of welcoming when Beowulf is welcomed into Hrothgar's hall, and a ritual called Sumbul, it's spelled symbol, but it's pronounced Sumbul, which is a drinking ritual. And this drinking ritual survived into Christian times in England. At the beginning of the ritual, the leader of the hall would take the horn that was given to him by the lady of the hall, and he would hold it up, and he would make an offering to Odin, Thor, and Frey. Well, in Christian times, that same ritual happened, but it was an offering to God, Jesus, and Saint Cuthbert, the patron saint of England, who is also famous because he's a god in Greyhawk and came into D&D. And so everyone's like, Saint Cuthbert? Yeah, Saint Cuthbert's a real saint. D&D just took him. So then, Saint Cuthbert, other than referencing, the patron saint of England and God and Jesus, the second and third parts of the ritual are exactly the same, because the ritual involves first telling a tale of one of your ancestors and something that they have done. And then the third part of the ritual is to tell something you have done that's so great. And that's the part of the story, if you're familiar with Beowulf, he's telling about how he fought those like sea monsters in the water. And then there's another guy, I forget his name, but he's the Thule of the hall, and he's questioning and challenging Beowulf. And in a lot of times, that particular Thule character gets made out to be an asshole who's challenging Beowulf when it's retold. But in truth, his job was super important. The Thule was allowed to question guests in the hall. And what this meant is that the king would never have to question guests. The king could always be polite and kind, but people who needed to be called out were still called out. And everyone understood not just the ritual importance of this role, but the societal importance of decorum is maintained, and yet we still get to know the things and do the things that are necessary when a guest comes to the hall. And all of that is preserved in poetic form in Beowulf. And there's an amazing book. I did a recommendation on my website for this book. It's called The Meadhall by Stephen Paulington. And it picks apart Beowulf and goes deep into the rituals there, but then it goes further into some excavations in England of Meadhall. It gets into like what they prepared for food in the Meadhall based on the residue left behind in these ancient sites. I mean, it goes so deep into this stuff, which if you're into a deep dive, The Meadhall by Stephen Paulington is, for me, it was just a fascinating read. I got the book from my father for Christmas a couple of years ago, and I read it in about 3 months, and very, very good stuff.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I actually, I just picked up I'm going through a list of these almost check boxes of books that I'm like, I need to read this, I need to read that. And I'm starting with Beowulf, and then I think I'm going to go kind of like some Arthurian, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and that kind of thing. And just kind of like try to build up these layers of what was happening in like pagan and Indo-European mythology, and hopefully just kind of get a strong basis on what I know and what I understand, and maybe put some links together here and there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and like I said, obviously I'm reading the I actually had another question. So we were talking earlier, and this may be a shorter one. But obviously, this whole conversation's been about like the prose Edda and the poetic Edda and the books and stories that fall in there. Where do the sagas fit in all this? Because, like I said, I'm reading now I've forgotten the name of the saga. There we go, the Volsung saga, yes. With Sinfielty and his father and like their whole lineage. And I'm reading the Jackson Crawford translation, cool. Which is really great. It's very digestible, very easy to read. And I appreciate when in the translation, it's like, there's this other guy and he did this and not really much else, so we're not going to mention him again. and I'm like, oh, thank you. I was afraid I was like signing up for like the Silmarillion trying to read these. I was like,
I mean, that is why the Silmarillion is the way that it is.
Right, yeah.
Tolkien's love of things like the Volsung saga, because Tolkien also translated the Volsung saga.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So what's interesting, so the sagas are various collections of writings and folk tales, primarily by the Icelanders. The Icelanders were far more enamored with their cultural history and with writing in general than most ancient people were. And there was just more being written down. And they read a bit like ancient soap operas. It's all about like who's cheating on who and who's killing who and who's been double-crossed. And, oh, by the way, this one-eyed guy shows up and we're always like, oh, that couldn't possibly be Odin.
Right.
And so they reference different parts. And so the sagas are written by a number of different people. And they're not historically accurate. They've been proven to not be historically accurate in many cases, but they are the collected wisdom of a culture trying to preserve its way of life. And I think if you look at it through that lens, that's pretty cool and pretty interesting. And not all the sagas are created equal. Some of them I find to be kind of boring. And I've read a few. I've certainly not read all of the sagas. That is, I know people have. I'm sure Jackson Crawford has. But, sure. Oh, man, that is an undertaking in and of itself. But there are sagas that people like quite a lot. One in particular, the saga of, anyway, we'll have to do another one on the sagas. I'll have to
there you go.
read it first. It's just not my specialty. And there's just so many different, so much different writing on it. But other books reference, pieces of them all the time. And so, yeah, I mean, there is more preserved in the sagas, but I think if anything's really preserved in the saga, it's more the folklore and the cultural folkways of the Icelandic people. And then some of the sagas are not written in Iceland. There's a few others that are outside, but they're more about the people and less about the gods. And the gods just kind of show up from time to time, throughout those stories.
Okay, yeah. All right. So then, we've got the prose Edda, which is the historical reference of the Nordic people through through the lens of Snorri.
Yep.
We've got the poetic Edda, which is essentially the written mythological poetry. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then we've got some sagas that are more just the folklore of the specifically Icelandic people, right?
For the most part, there are other sagas from other cultures, but the Icelandic sagas are the most numerous. And I don't know I know some of the sagas come quite later, and so I wonder if the popularity of Snorri in his own lifetime may have influenced the sagas. As other people read Snorri in the same way that, we were all playing D&D and getting excited about shared mythology, that other people would too. And I also, there's, in the same way that we hold a romantic notion to the pagan past and our cultural roots, I wouldn't be surprised if ancient people's imaginations were just as equally piqued by those ideas.
I mean, I would agree with that. I would say that that's probably true. Just going off of the Volsung saga, where I think I'm like 13 or 14 or so chapters in, and the chapters are very short, which I appreciate. But just seeing, like Sinfielti and his father like put on wolf skin, so they transform into wolves, and they're like, let's go out and rob people for a while.
That's a reference to the boy wolf culture I was telling you earlier, where it was like, that's why they're out raiding, is because that was what youths were good for.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's like and you even get a little bit of that because when they put those wolf skins on, the father, I can't remember his name. Sinfielti is the son, but they put their wolf skins on and they're like, hey, let's go out and rob people and take what we can for I think 10 days is when the spell wears off at the end of 10 days. And the father is like, look, we can each take 7 people by ourselves, but if you get any more than 7, call me for help and I'll come running. And what does Sinfielti do? He goes and he like tries to tackle 11 people, and he gets not mortally wounded, but he does get mortally wounded, and then they kind of go and retreat until and when I think he takes the skin off and like the wound magically heals, and they bury the wolf skins, and they're like, trolls take these wolf skins, and but what was that story about? It's about like the reckless youth taking on that wolf form, like you were talking about. And what does he do? They go out raiding, which is standard Viking shit. We understand. Yeah. But
standard human shit.
Right. Yeah, totally. And what happens? He immediately gets in over his head, and like dad's got to come save him, so you definitely get that, like the youth culture.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. I think a lot of people, when they start looking back at history and mythology, we imagine that the people writing these mythologies were naive or more youthful or less knowledgeable about the world. And that is just not so. They were just as sophisticated as we are today, in some cases, if not more so, because their senses of intuition and their knowledge of the natural world were higher than ours are today. Certainly, we have more knowledge of technology and science, but I'm not sure in all ways that that's an improvement. Certainly, I like air conditioning a great deal, and we're talking over the computer, so there are improvements to be had. But I think it's important to remember that emotionally, people were just as sophisticated back then as we are today. So anyway, Kenny, I can't tell. It looks like you might have frozen one more time, but I think we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode. We've been talking for
there we go.
There it is. We've been talking for about 50 minutes here, so I was thinking we'd probably wrap this thing up. Are you able to talk, Kenny, or are you bowing out?
I mean, but
all right. Well, thank you guys for joining. If you want to see that article I wrote, you can go to fatefulsigns.com/news/Meadhall. And I put a link in the chat for this episode. There's not a lot going on in the chat. So for the few people who are watching us live, thank you so much for watching us live. I appreciate that. I think that's super cool. And if you'd like to get a copy of the Hávamál, I have those books available on my website or the Völuspá. But if you sign up for the mailing list, you'll get chapter 1 of the Hávamál sent to you as a PDF for free as a thank you for signing up for my mailing list. So anyway, maybe we'll do this again sometime, Kenny. Thanks again for all the questions.
Thank you, man.
All right. Well, we will see you guys later on. Hope everybody has a good weekend.